Hi everyone, my name is Hannah Gillespie, if I don't know you, and it is my privilege to be able to conclude this wonderful conference we've been having by sharing my research progress on sustainable eucheumatoid farming at scale, assessing pathways for growth in the seaweed industry. I'm so excited to talk with you about seaweed today. I'm going to start with a question perhaps some of you are thinking, especially if you've spoken with me in the last few months, and that question is, what on earth is your obsession with seaweed all about? So I have this in quotes because this was a real question asked not to me, but in an interview to His Royal Highness Prince William only 7 months ago. So the interview was taking place within the context of the Earthshot Prize, which is an award given to companies pursuing climate-friendly innovations. 3 of the winners or finalists of the Earthshot Prize in the last 3 years have had seaweed as the base of their pitch, including Sea Forest, an Australian startup that grows a native red seaweed that, when added to cow feed, can reduce the methane emission of cows by up to 90%. And the other, Notpla, is a London-based Imperial College spin-out, which uses the carbohydrate component of seaweed to make bioplastics. Most recently, they featured their sustainable packaging and seaweed-based spoon at the Wimbledon tennis tournament and have received over $20 million in funding. So how did the prince respond to the question, what is his obsession with seaweed all about? He listed 3 of the most commonly cited benefits of seaweed, including that it sequesters carbon, cleans the ocean as it grows by absorbing toxins, heavy metals, and excess nitrogen and phosphorus, and also you can make things out of it, including bioplastics, but I'll also add biostimulants for agriculture, nutraceuticals, biofuels, could be used for sustainable aviation fuels, and also seaweed-based construction bricks. So this is all part of a revolution that is happening right now, dubbed the Seaweed Revolution. Many people see the benefits of seaweed applying to some of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. As we have a growing population, we can use blue foods, including edible seaweeds, to feed people. Seaweed farming can provide a source of coastal empowerment and income diversification for smallholder farmers, many of whom are women. And then, as stated, seaweed does have benefits for cleaning ocean health and also providing structure for marine life underwater. So, are we right to call this age that we're living in the time of the seaweed revolution, or are we rather in a seaweed delusion, as some critics call it? Seaweed is often talked about as a panacea for many of our climate-related issues. However, when we look at the actual seaweed farming industry, we see it's a lot more complex. Seaweed farming is extremely labor-intensive. It involves very manual seeding of lines, maintenance in the water, and harvesting, often leaving the seaweed out to dry for days in the sun, even on roads. There's been an increased impact of climate-related stress on the productivity of seaweed farming and a prevalence of disease and pests, which have been leading to crop loss. And also the whole industry gives itself to boom and bust cycles, especially with the volatile market conditions. And so just a quick step back, just want to explain exactly what I mean by seaweed, eucheumatoids, and seaweed farming. So seaweed is the word we give to macroalgae, which are photosynthetic organisms which grow in either marine, saltwater, or also freshwater, broken down into brown, red, and green types. Of the 12,000 species that make up seaweed, we only farm about 5. You may be familiar with some, including nori and wakame. Also, giant kelp is famous for being able to grow up to 2 feet per day. But the seaweed I'm going to be focusing on is eucheumatoids up here, which are grown and valuable for their ability you can extract carrageenan from them, which carrageenan is a hydrocolloid. It's the carbohydrate component, which can be used as a thickening or gelling agent in many applications. So that's why eucheumatoids are valuable. To farm them, it takes about 45 days to grow. Farmers will sell their crop to a local trader who will then sell it to a processor to extract the carrageenan. Eucheumatoid farming was started in the Philippines in 1974. It was actually brought to Tanzania by several USAID workers as a form of increasing income diversification for coastal communities there in 1989. And then in the early 2000s, Indonesia passed the Philippines as the largest producer of eucheumatoids worldwide. So I'm interested in eucheumatoids for 3 reasons. One, we have increasing demand and pressure from this new interest in the field. Then we also noticed this decline, which happened in 2015. That was due to these climate-related stresses, diseases causing a decline in productivity, plus a crash in market prices. And finally, Eucheumatoids has the interesting history of being expanded for livelihood enhancement. Tanzania is one of the largest producers of seaweed outside of Southeast Asia. So, my research question: what system dynamics enable the sustainable, resilient, and equitable growth of eucheumatoid seaweed farming for all stakeholders in the industry? I have 3 objectives. One is to understand the perspectives of all those stakeholders. The next is to analyze the model through a causal loop diagram, and the third to provide recommendations and growth pathways. So I had the privilege of attending a conference on seaweed farming back in May at the University of California, Berkeley, where I got to speak with many industry players. And then also in my preliminary literature review, I was just noticing this gap between more technical focused papers that would inspect, for example, how increasing the density impacts the yield, versus more of these socioeconomic papers that would really look at seaweed farming as a form of empowerment, especially through a gender lens. And so I found fewer works that would combine both of these into a holistic study, and also very few that looked through it with a systems dynamics analysis. Only found one paper that did a causal loop diagram, and it was in Indonesia, so that was helpful for cross comparison. And then I also found in my literature review that there's just such a diversity in frameworks that are applied to this question of seaweed farming. And I found too that a lot of the frameworks are brought over from adjacent industries, either from fishing or tropical coastal communities, but also from land-based agriculture. So there wasn't it's kind of a niche topic, so there's not really a clear framework to apply specifically to this form of aquaculture. So I extracted elements from a couple of the frameworks I had found, combined with the Sustainable Livelihoods framework, originally written by Robert Chambers, and that's where I get my sustainable, equitable, and resilient elements. Now moving on to my methodology, it's a 3-part methodology, and the first part is identifying stakeholders and then plotting their agency in the system using this rainbow diagram. The next is identifying key system variables, first through literature review, then identifying a list and iterating that list through stakeholder interviews. The next is formulating my dynamic hypothesis, dynamic meaning it's going to change frequently. And I do this by first making a Micmac matrix, which is fun to say, and I will explain that more later in detail in the Q&A if you ask me. But basically it is a chart where you can plot the relative influence of one variable on the other, and then look at the direct and indirect variables in the system. That's what I use to inform the creation of my causal loop diagram. And again, this is all iterated through with stakeholder interviews, and finally consolidating insights and creating a dashboard to display my growth pathways. So moving on to my results, here's my rainbow diagram, which again tracks the level of influence, or how much people are affected by elements in the system and to what level. And I found that there's many people involved. The seaweed industry is very complex, but many people influence the system more than feel the consequences of those decisions that they make. And the stakeholders who are already the most vulnerable, including the farmers, environment, and future societies, have the least agency to change their vulnerability status, as there's many factors that are outside their control, as you see in the quote here. Continuing on, I performed a scoping literature review, so I searched for terms such as seaweed, aquaculture, equity, resilience, and then filtered by the countries I'm interested in that grow by eucheumatoid seaweeds. I read 133 abstracts, brought that down to 34 works for my detailed literature review, coded 119 codes in Atlas, and then narrowed that down to 82. You can see these are the 15 most cited codes on the left here, which indicates the number of times these came up across the 34 documents. Next, I'm skipping the details of the Micmac chart, but the point was there is a difference, a discrepancy between variables that have large direct influence on the system, such as it's very clearly the link between disease and crop loss is very clear. but there's many more variables that have indirect influences that we have more control over influencing. And of course, this sounds a little bit like leverage points in my causal loop diagram, which makes sense as that's where the correlation will be. So I used the results of my Micmac matrix to inform my causal loop diagram, which is a bit of an upgrade from the one I have on my poster. Again, it's a continuity of the iterative process, and so this is continuing to be developed. This is an example of one of the balancing loops that I've developed, and I've also labeled each of the interventions under the sustainable, equitable, and resilient elements you can see there. And so just want to talk through a little of my, 3 of my findings. One is that interventions are necessary to grow eucheumatoid farming, but unless gender is taken into account, some of the interventions can be ineffective. And this is evidenced in other socioeconomic works, but I found that a lot of the technical works failed to take this finding into account in their interventions. So just one of the examples is that a lot of women in Tanzania, where 80% of the seaweed farmers are women, are able to farm in the marine intertidal zone, which is close to home, and they can do their maintenance during times of low tide. So they're also flexible in when they can go out. So then an intervention came to introduce a new technique using tubular nets, which is a deep water technique. Moving to the deep water is good because there's less competition for marine space, and the water is also cooler, so the crop is more resilient there. But the researchers in the study found that the women were not able to access that intervention because they didn't have time to go to the deep water and come back to take care of their household responsibilities. And also prevailing cultural norms in that area prohibited women from learning how to swim or drive a boat without a man. And so there was an inability to access that intervention. We also see gender discrepancy both in access to market information as well as access to credit in different training programs. And so some of my recommended pathways here is that interventions do need to be gender nuanced, and that is across both men and women. As in some other places in Malaysia, the men are less able to access credit. So it just depends on the context where you are at. And then the next is increasing value-added activities, such as turning the seaweed into an increased commodity, such as soaps and cosmetics, and being able to sell that in the local market could be a viable way of increasing the profitability of seaweed farming across genders. And finally, just recognizing the importance of women's groups in improving women's agency, leadership, and socioeconomic status, as well as a sense of social cohesion. The next finding is contract farming systems put smallholders and traders in cycles of vulnerability in which they are given supplies to then do their work, but then forced into these fixed term agreements where they have to sell their crop for prices that may not be the going market price at that time. So recommended pathways for breaking out of these cycles of poverty include more access to credit and loans, increased access to the international market price, which can be done through digital means, and also international quality standards, which would streamline the price per quality that traders and farmers agree on. And finally, increasing the bioresilience of eucheumatoid strands may have one of the largest impacts for the long-term resilience and sustainability of this industry. And this is due to a long history of clonal propagation and monocropping, which has left the current eucheumatoid strands very vulnerable to disease and pests. And so investing in, first implementing international biosecurity measures to prohibit the spread of infected seedlings, as often seedlings are cut from one strand to then propagate the next strand, could help. Also investing in gene banking and building bioresilience by crossbreeding with wild strands, and then also moving to deep water farming where possible. But again, there's some different nuances around the ability of farmers to do that. So some of the limitations in my study, this is not a life cycle analysis of the applications of seaweed, so I'm not going through the embodied carbon of bioplastics, for example, against plastics. That's definitely very interesting and important, and should be done and has been done in literature. My research so far has a small sample size of literature, 34 works, and then I haven't completed my interviews yet, but I have 8 to 10 estimated and growing as they continue to snowball. And finally, this is a qualitative review, so it is difficult to track impacts and the actual effectiveness of these interventions, but I can make recommendations and say what has worked in the past. And finally, my research is most applicable to red tropical hydrocolloid seaweeds, which again are the Eucheumatoids, but also Gracilaria, which are farmed in similar ways. This would not apply for seaweeds such as kelp. And then my next steps is to continue to do the interviews, to validate my variables, to continue to iterate my causal loop diagram through the MCMAC ranking and expert validation interviews, and then to develop that dashboard, which will look a little bit like my pathways in this presentation. And finally, just to conclude, a sustainable, resilient, and equitable future is possible, but it's not inevitable. We do have to work for it. And the interventions that take place should ensure the co-benefits that are promised by the seaweed revolution while minimizing the unintended consequences and impacts on the vulnerable stakeholders in the industry. And we do have to start acting now, as these demands will only increase in the future. And the whole supply chain must be ready to take all of the bioplastics that Prince William's NOPPLA Earthshot Prize-backed companies will be promoting in the future. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much for closing us in fine style there. I'll pass over to Edouard.
Thanks so much for the great presentation. I have a question from Louise online regarding the first preliminary result on gender. Are there interventions that could support women's groups in specific parts of the seaweed supply chain?
I'll start by saying that the intervention with the tubular nets, even though it didn't work in that the women weren't able to access the technology, they still, in that study, talked about the empowerment scale and found that the women still increased knowledge about seaweed practices. They formed a community group out of that, and I think the number was they worked with 95% more women in their community than they would have with just the other method, the off-bottom peg and spokes method. And so anything that can provide opportunities for social community groups to come together can be a form of women's empowerment. And the other thing is that as you go up the value chain, so in Tanzania, for example, most of the seaweed farmers, 80% are women, but most of the traders are men. And as you go up to the processors, it's very male-dominated. So having more opportunities to get women in the trader or processor positions could also help increase their empowerment along the value chain.
Hannah, incredible presentation. I have 2 questions. So the first one being, I'm particularly intrigued by the recommendation that you put as the value, like a more value-adding processing for the seaweed. And I think it resembles to one of the policy that's just been made for the nickel processing in Indonesia with the nickel, like the raw nickel export ban. I don't know if you have had a chance to talk to any of the Indonesian stakeholders and see whether that kind of policy implementation has also been implemented in seaweed in particular. Second question being, have you seen any middleman exploitation, particularly also in Indonesia, because I think that's also one of the persistent issues that it's facing the smallholder farmers. Yeah.
Brian, can you say that your last question again?
The middleman exploitation.
Right.
So,
yeah, the contract farmer systems. Okay, yeah, I haven't seen anything about restrictions like in the marketplace for the value-added products. but that is all extremely local, and it could be either making things out of the seaweed, but it could also be introducing seaweed as a new form of diet for community members. Seaweed is a huge part of the diet in Southeast Asia, but not so much in Tanzania, and so even I think there was a movement in Tanzania to have all of the local restaurants have at least a certain amount of seaweed on their menu to help support the local farmers. And so that was one of the initiatives that could also be implemented. And then your question was about exploitation of the middlemen. Yeah, that is one of the issues in the industry, and I think it comes down to the fact that many seaweed farmers are often in rural communities where there's only one distribution channel, and that's the local trader. And so that's where they get all of their information about what is the price that I deserve for this crop that I've produced based on this quality, and also that's how they make their livelihood. So this is what I'm talking about with the dependence. It's a very complex relationship because the farmers need the traders in order to sell their crop, but then there's also an issue too of contract breaking. For example, if the buyers do find somebody willing to give them a higher price, or from the trader's side, if the market's not high enough, they won't actually buy the seaweed that they promised to buy. So there's definitely issues along the value chain there.
Hi, Hannah, amazing presentation. I wanted to get more information about the Micmac that you mentioned in passing, because you mentioned that
Sure.
you mentioned that it informed the construction of your CLD, so
Yeah.
I want to see how that works.
Sure, I can start with that. Yeah, thank you, B. So the Micmac matrix I have right here. It's essentially, this is just a very simplified version, just a 3x3 to walk you through how it works. Very simply, you're rating the influence of the variables on the left on each of the variables on the right. And so of course we can add zeros down the middle, but then we look and say, okay, genetic variety has an influence on crop loss and failure. And so we put that attitude based on how often it appears in the literature. We go along and do this for all of the other elements. Clonal propagation has an influence on genetic variety. Note that the Micmac matrix does not tell directionality with this, so this is determined later on. But essentially what we can do with this is sum the rows and the columns, and then we can, that's the measure of influence and dependence, we can plot this, and this tells us which variables have the highest direct influence on the system. But then we do a little matrix multiplication, so we square the matrix and then subtract the direct influence from it. We can actually get the plot of the indirect influence over the direct influence. So you can see all of the variables that have the largest indirect influence through the system will rise to the top here, which is why you can see clonal propagation there as it affects crop loss through genetic variety. So that's, from this is how I got the relationships, which then inform my loop.
And to close out the conference, we'll take one last question from Aya.
Thanks, Hannah, for the presentation. I want to build a bit on Brian's question. So given that, with time, hopefully we're going to be seeing more plastic bans, so demand for things like bioplastic will probably be increasing. So how can we ensure that this won't be just another industry that will be taken over by capitalist interests?
Yeah. Well, I think it's good that the industry does make money for smallholder farmers. I think it can be a form of livelihood in terms of economic sustainable livelihoods for them. But of course, with sustainability, we need to make sure we're above the social foundation but below the ecological ceiling, so we can't go beyond our planetary boundaries. And so if we want to make bioplastics feasible, for example, we're going to have to make those as affordable as possible, right, to compete with petroleum-based plastics, which the oil and gas industry is already subsidizing for plastic use. So to scale up seaweed farming, it is it's a competitive thing, but we need to make sure we do so in a way that doesn't cause these harmful negative impacts on the marine environment. For example, making your farms too dense could prohibit the growth of seagrass underneath because not enough light is coming through. And also there's an issue, actually, talking about plastic, is that many of the farmers will use plastic bottles as a flotation device to keep their lines afloat. And they also use mangrove trees as the sticks. And so as we increase seaweed farming, there's also this unintended consequence of more plastic pollution in the ocean, which is a bit ironic, and also the decrease in mangrove trees. And so actually some seaweed farm researchers in the Philippines are looking at, can we make bioplastics out of our seaweed to then use as our flotation devices for our farming operations?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Hannah. That brings us our conference to a close.